If you're like me and you're starting to expand your apiary, you're finding it more and more challenging to feed all these colonies. So instead of individually feeding these colonies, maybe you're thinking about switching to an open feeding method. But what are some of the pros? What are some of the cons? What are some of the methods of open feeding? Well, you're in luck. I'm about to discuss all that and much more in this video coming up right now.
Hey guys, it's Kyle with Hornbaker Acres. We're a small beekeeping operation in Buckeye, Arizona. We utilize our channel to further educate people on various aspects and methods of beekeeping. And when we can, we take you along with us for live bee rescues. So if you're new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And while you're here, check out some of the videos that we've already done. On today's video, we're going to talk about open feeding. Well, what is open feeding? Open feeding is simply providing a food source, usually through pollen substitute and sugar syrup, outside of the hive. So there are a lot of pros, a lot of cons with open feeding, so we're going to jump right into them. Okay, so first we're going to go over some of the pros of open feeding. First and foremost, it is quick and easy to feed a lot of colonies this way. Instead of having to individually feed each colony and refill feeders at each colony, you simply go to one location and refill your feeders. It's quick, you dump the feed in there and you're done, and you fed all of your colonies at this point. And again, as your apiary expands, you're going to start finding it more and more challenging and time consuming to feed these colonies because you have to go into every single colony and provide food. So with open feeding, you can feed a ton of colonies. Another nice thing about it is very cost effective. Again, with individually feeding all these colonies, that means individual feeders for each of these colonies. With open feeding, you have one food source. So you just have to, no matter how many colonies you can have just this one food source for the most part. So instead of buying all these individual feeders, you just have to have these one open feeding stations. Also, another nice thing is it helps deter robbing and pests. Now, what I mean by that is, especially with entrance feeders, you know, the jar style entrance feeders for sugar syrup, those tend to leak and drip, which means that you're going to have sugar syrup dripping down the entrance of the hive. Well, ants will find that and they'll start using it as a food source, and then soon enough they'll make their way into your colony and start wreaking havoc within your colony. If your colony is really strong, they typically deal with ants just fine, but if your colony is already kind of weak, if it's a new colony, you may find this to be a major issue with ants in your hive. Also, with that sugar syrup leaking down the front of the hive, it will draw robber bees or bees from other colonies trying to steal that food source as well. Since that entrance that jar is right at the entrance, it's easy enough for outside bees to fight their way in to rob into it. And soon enough, they will find the rest of the food stores in the colony, especially if that colony is kind of weak or kind of new, and rob it out. It'll happen pretty quickly. So having this open food source away from those hives really helps deter all those issues. Now, there are some downsides to open feeding. First and foremost, it feeds all of the bees in the area. And what I mean by that is it's not just feeding your colonies. It feeds the feral colonies, or if you have a commercial beekeeper in your area, it will feed their colonies as well. So once you start open feeding, you'll notice that you're going to go through a lot more feed than you normally do individually feeding your colonies. So you may want to consider that when thinking about switching to open feeding. Also, you can't control which of your colonies have food and which don't. So there may be a scenario where you have some new 5-frame nukes set up that you need to feed to help them grow, but you've also got in the same area some really strong colonies with plenty of food stores. Well, you only want to feed the nukes, but you don't want to feed the large colonies. You can't decide on that with open feeding. All of the bees in the area, all of your bees in the area, are going to have access to this open food source. Also, another problem that arises is, again, if you have small colonies in your apiary, but you have some large colonies as well, you want to feed those small colonies, but these large colonies are ready for some honey supers, so that way you can start collecting honey. Well, you can't feed your colonies with honey supers on. You don't do it. Otherwise, you're just collecting sugar syrup as honey. So it makes it difficult if you're starting to grow your apiary, starting out with small colonies that need to be fed and then collect honey at the same time. So that does make it very challenging. When I personally weigh the pros versus the cons, I still prefer to open feed. It's just easier for me. At some point, I will move my colonies to different locations, and I'll have several yards. And at that point, it's easy enough for me to separate the colonies that need to be fed from the colonies that don't need to be fed. So that way I can feed at one location and not feed at another. So here in a moment, I'm going to take you out to my feeding stations. And again, this is the way I do it. You'll see the tubs that I use. Basically, all it is just storage tubs with holes cut in the side. And then I can put the feed source on the inside. One note about my feeding stations is the pollen feeder. We've had rain here the last couple of days here in Buckeye, and I've had pollen in these tubs. Now, the pollen does get a little damp, mostly around the outside edge of the tub, basically on the inside of the tub, the outside edge of the pollen. Does get a little damp, but I've never really seen a major issue from it. But we haven't been getting the downpours. So it may cause an issue if you get a downpour of rain to open feed pollen using the method that I do. So take a moment, leave a comment below on if you're open feeding or not, why you decide to open feed, and maybe some of the methods that you use. So let's go ahead and head outside and I'll show you exactly what method I'm using to open feed my colonies.
So guys, here are the open feeders I was discussing earlier. So on the left you see an open feeder for pollen, on the right is for sugar syrup. They look pretty similar, and that's because they're basically made the same way with one exception. On the right, for the sugar syrup, I can open this up here. Like I discussed kind of earlier, alright, so on the right you see here, on the inside for the sugar syrup, it's empty now. The ladies drain it pretty quickly. But there's wine corks in there, and that's to give them something to land on, okay? Other than that, they are pretty much the same. As you can see, inside there is pollen, Ultra B pollen, that they're collecting from. So what I've done with these is they're just normal storage tubs. I've used a 4-inch hole saw to cut a bunch of ports, if you want to call it that, in the tops of each one. Now I've got the pollen one strapped down because it's much lighter, and I want to make sure that the wind doesn't blow away this tub with that fairly expensive bee pollen in it compared to sugar syrup at least. So again, up here I've got the wine corks and some branches in there for the sugar syrup, again with the ports all the way around the top. So these are pretty simple to make. I will have a link in the description to the tubs and the bee pollen and the wine corks in question.
So there we go, guys. That is open feeding. As you saw from outside, pretty simple, easy, and cheap to make. Pretty effective as well. Make sure to leave a comment below. Let me know what you think about this whole thing. Also, while you're here, be sure to subscribe because we're going to be making more videos in the future and I don't want you to miss them. If you have any suggestions of videos that we should do, make sure to leave a comment below on that as well. As we always say, we truly appreciate all the love, kindness, and support that you guys show us here at YouTube and at our Facebook page. And while I'm talking about that, make sure you check us out on Facebook. It's Hornbaker Acres LLC on Facebook. Also, make sure you check out our website, www.hornbakeracres.com, where we have plenty of articles on do-it-yourself projects or just various information about beekeeping. We also have photos, and we talk about our bee removal service there as well. I hope you guys are having a beautiful day and happy beekeeping.